Hello, I'm Bijoy. I'm a software engineering architect specialized in identity and access management. Today's session is about OAuth. In today's session, I'll talk about why, what, and how of OAuth. I'll talk about why OAuth came into existence, what is involved in OAuth, and how OAuth is achieved. Let me start with why. What we are looking at right now is a screenshot from the year 2008. As you can see here, Help is trying to find out whether your friends are already on Help. So to get that done, Help is asking you to enter or select your email service provider. It's asking you for your email address. It's asking you to share the password associated with your email address. Let's see what Help will do with this information. The diagram here represents what happens with the ID and password that you share with Help. So using this ID and password, it authenticates with the Gmail service provider and retrieves your contacts from your Gmail account. After retrieving the contacts from your account, it displays it on the web page for you to review. So what are the risks involved in sharing your password like this? The first risk is that it increases the attack surface. The more your password is spread across the web, the more chances of it gets stolen from any of these websites. The next risk is the increased desensitization of users towards third-party password requests. The more and more third-party companies keep asking the user for the password, the chances of user getting phished goes higher and higher. The third risk is accidental or deliberate misuse of the password by those companies that are aware of your password. So that brings up this question as to how to avoid password sharing. Password sharing can be avoided by using a mechanism that enables sharing of protected data between applications on a need-to-know basis without revealing or sharing of username or password. It's here that the OAuth 2.0 framework comes into the picture. So what is OAuth framework? The OAuth 2.0 authorization framework is a protocol that allows a user to grant a third-party website or application access to the user's protected resources without revealing the user's identity or credentials. That's what we see in the diagram here. The client has got restricted and controlled access to the resources of the user. The resource provider, which holds the resources on behalf of the user, will give restricted and controlled access to the client. Let's take a look at a sample OAuth client. What we have here is a website called Print My Pics, which needs access to your Google Photos. So what we see here is that the user does not have to share his ID and password with the third-party company. Next, let's look at the OAuth Flow. The OAuth framework defines four roles. One is the resource owner, that is the user that owns the resource and has the credentials to access it. Then we have the client. Client is the application that wants access to the protected resource. The third role is that of the authorization server. Authorization server provides the client with the temporary access token after getting authorization from the client. The fourth role is that of the resource server. The resource server hosts the resource that the client wants access to. Let us do a walkthrough of the OAuth flow. The client that wants access to a protected resource makes an authorization request either directly to the user or preferably through a resource provider as an intermediary. The authorization request will result in an authorization grant which gets passed back to the client. In step 3, the client uses this authorization grant to get an access token back from the authorization server. And in step 5, the access token is used by the client to make a request to the resource server to get access to the protected resource. Let's now talk about the authorization grants. There are 4 different types of authorization grants defined by the OAuth spec. So, an authorization grant is a credential representing the resource owner's authorization and is used by the client to obtain an access token. The first type of authorization grant is known as the authorization code. The authorization code is obtained by using an authorization server as an intermediary between the client and the user. Before generating the authorization code, the authorization server authenticates the user and obtains consent from the user. Another type of authorization grant that the client can get access to is known as the implicit grant. In implicit grant, the client is issued an access token directly after authentication of the user and authorization from the user. No intermediate code gets generated. The third type of authorization grant is known as the resource owner password credentials. In this, the resource owner's credentials, that is the username and password, can be used directly by the client as an authorization grant to obtain the access token. This type of grants are usually reserved when there's a high amount of trust between the client and the resource owner. The fourth type of authorization grant is known as the client credentials. Here, the client credentials or any other form of client authentication can be used as an authorization grant, which can be used to obtain the access token from the authorization server. Usually, this scope is limited to protected resources that are directly under the control of the client. Let's now talk about client registration. So, before a client can initiate the OAuth flow, it needs to get registered with the authorization server. So as part of this registration process, the client needs to provide its client type, examples whether it's a public client or a confidential client, and the client also provides additional information to the authorization server. The registration process is not defined by the OAuth specs, and it usually happens using any secure mechanism defined by the authorization server. The OAuth spec defines 2 different types of tokens. The first one is known as access token, which is a string representing an authorization issued to the client. This is the authorization issued to the client on behalf of the user. These access tokens represent specific scopes and duration of access granted to the client. The next type of token is known as a refresh token. Refresh token is issued to the client by the authorization server, which can then be used by the client to obtain a new access token when the current access token expires. Issuing a refresh token is optional and is usually at the discretion of the authorization server. To wind up this discussion, let's talk about the endpoints defined in OAuth 2.0 specs. The OAuth spec defines the authorized endpoint, which handles the authorization request. The next endpoint is the token endpoint. The token endpoint handles the token request. The token endpoint is used by all four grant types. This endpoint is used to obtain the access token or the refresh token. There are advanced topics around the security of the tokens, the scope of the tokens, and so on, which I will leave for another session. Please take a moment to share your feedback and also to like and subscribe to this video.